Hey, Fat Puppy here. Today I'm standing in front of the Church of the Holy Cross Episcopalian Church. This church was started as a chapel of ease for St. Mark's Church. A chapel of ease was basically like you had a headquarters church that was kind of far away, and so a secondary church called an ease church was built to for the people in the nearby region to go to, so they would have to go to the main church. In this case, St. Mark's, the main church, is 17 miles away in Pinewood. Here we're in the Statesburg area of South Carolina. This church was was built on land donated by Thomas Sumter. Thomas Sumter was a Revolutionary War hero general. And so this is land that he owned and that he donated to the Church of the Holy Cross. By the way, I hope you enjoy these videos as much as I enjoy making them. I just love history, and I love the South, and I love this area history, and I plan to go out further. If you do like it, how about hit that subscribe button? And if you ring the like it, give it a thumbs up. And if you ring that bell, you get notified every time I make another video. So anyway, do that. So the church had been here, not this building, but the Chapel of Ease had been here since around 1770. And then in 1850 to 1852, they built this church. Dr. William Wallace Anderson, who owns the plantation, or owned, I should say, the plantation across the street, he's the one that had a lot to do with how this church was built. It is built of rammed earth, as is his house. Rammed earth was something I'd never heard of before. I didn't know anything about it, so I had to do a little research. Basically what they did is they built forms 2 feet. Basically the walls here are 2 feet thick. So they packed it with red clay dirt. They would build the wood up. Basically, let me get out here a little further. They built the wood up, and then they would pack it with dirt. Then they would build wood further up, pack it with dirt, and then they'd cover it with stucco. That's called rammed earth. It's its own insulation, basically. And living in the deep South, that was a good thing. You know, to keep, especially in the summertime, to help kind of keep cool inside there. In the cemetery, there are over 100 remains of people. Now you hear that truck going by. This is kind of a busy road, and even though it's a little country road, it's a busy country road. Anyway, as I was saying, there are over 100 veterans of the Revolutionary, Confederate, World War I, and World War II buried here. And I will highlight a handful of them, not many, when we get back to the cemetery. So, are there any ghost stories associated with this church, with this graveyard? You bet your sweet patootie. Indeed, there's one of a Confederate, a man in Confederate uniform walking around and just looking down at the graves, kind of checking them out. There's another one that says that there's a young lady that sits in low-lying branches just looking over everything. So, and I've heard there's more too. I'm not a ghost hunter, but I know people want to know about this kind of stuff, and it's interesting. So, oh yeah, there's a couple ghost stories associated with a place like this. I believe I read somewhere that there are around 600 people buried in this cemetery. By looking at the stones, obviously they're not all marked, but they have documented there's about 600 if I remember looking at my information correctly. What I'm going to do now is highlight some of these people, because to me, the dash between born and died, it's a story. One of the reasons I love family history, my family history, your family history, is there's a story. I have this geeky habit. For instance, in a cemetery, I'll see a stone and I'll just take an interest in it, and I'll look up the person on that stone, Google it, and just see if there's anything. Most times there's not, but sometimes there's a lot. And a lot of it can be pretty interesting stuff. Everybody has a life story, and all these people that are buried here represent an individual life story, a story of struggles, of living, of happiness, and of joy. And if you think about it, in this yard and any other graveyard or cemetery across anywhere in the world, tears. These people died and people cried. So anyway, I'm going to start highlighting some of them that I know about in my research. The ones that they're just more interesting, or that I was just able to find information for, about. I'm sure there are many here that are a lot more interesting than what I found. I am at the grave of Joel Poinsett. Now you might recognize that name. Poinsettia flower, our Christmas flowers that we love so much. Not only was he a botanist, but he was an adventurer. He was a representative from South Carolina. He'd been all over the world. He was in Russia, all parts of Europe, Central America, South America, Mexico, from where he made the poinsettia flower popular. He was even in Persia, where he got in a little bit of trouble. It seems that someone stole his horse, and rather than just kind of let things go and leave, he went to whoever the local ruler was and wanted to get his horse back. The ruler had never even heard of the United States at that point in time. And so he had to convince this ruler over in Persia just how great the United States was. And the guy gave him back his horses and sent him on his way. Joel Poinsett also owned slaves, which was common for rich people back then, landowners, to have slaves. Most people didn't have them, but you know, just like now, the rich have the stuff, and the slaves were the stuff, if you'll pardon me for being so crass about it. But yet he was against the institution of slavery. He didn't really write against it so much as where his votes went. There were votes that would come up in the South Carolina legislature to kind of promote slavery, or at least hold on to it, and he would vote against them. And even though he died, he lived from, give me just a moment here, 1779 to 1851. So even though he died about 10 years before the start of the Civil War, succession had already been talked about a lot, and he was against it. So he was buried here alongside his wife. Now, how he died? He had a plantation in Charleston, and his wife had one in the upstate around the Greenville area, I think. I don't know why two separate plantations. I would imagine it was a matter of those what she inherited, and so she had to take care of that. So at 72 years old, he was on his way from Charleston to the upstate. The highway in front of this church is known as the King's Road, or the Great Road. And it was one of, I think, 11 roads that, before this time, the King of England wanted to try to get people to settle up into the back country of South Carolina. So he commissioned this road from Charleston up to the upstate. This was one of 11 roads. And so he was on that road making that journey. He had what he called consumption. We call it tuberculosis now. But along the way, he got pneumonia. Well, across the street is the plantation, the Burroughs Plantation. It's still there. The house is still there. I've been there many times, not inside, but outside, doing some different work and stuff that I used to do. So that's a doctor that lived over there. Matter of fact, his son was also a doctor. So for 100 years, they had a continuing doctor's office at the edge of the plantation on the King's Highway. So Mr. Poinsett was on his way to visit his wife. He had tuberculosis. He come down with pneumonia, and he died. And I guess, you know, they really couldn't move him 150, 200 miles before it became a real stinky journey, if you know what I mean. So I guess they just had to kind of bury him where he died at. I don't think he was a member of this church or anything. So they just buried him here. And there are other tombstones here we're going to talk about. 1808. This is the, I believe, oldest or second oldest stone in the cemetery. This is Rachel Davis Frierson, who lived from 1751 to 1808, and her husband, Major John Frierson, who I believe was in the Revolutionary War. That's where he got his rank from. She died at 57 years old. She was the grandmother of John Napoleon Frierson. Now, John Napoleon Frierson was a very colorful character, had a huge plantation. The airplanes that you hear are part of Shaw Air Force Base. Most if not all of the land of Shaw Air Force Base come from John Napoleon Frierson. They said that he was a very sharp dresser. He was known as a Jim Dandy. Anyway, they were not originally buried here. They were moved here in 1941. And there's a marker in front that you can't see, but I'm going to read. It says, and I hope you'll pardon those airplanes, the graves from which these, let's wait a minute. Okay. The graves from which these remains and stones are located in the Frierson family burying ground on Waibu Plantation, Clarendon County, covered by the waters of Santee Lake. So basically, where their plantation was is now underwater. The Santee River comes down through part of South Carolina. They flooded it and made a really nice lake. There's a lot of history underneath that lake, and I may cover that one day. I think the oldest grave here is from 1802, from Miss Ann Isabella Cleland Kinloch. She was born in 1735 and died in 1802 at 67 years old. She was the mother of Francis Kinloch, who was a member of the Continental Congress. Now, those are two daughters of hers. So while I can't find her stone, I'm sure it's here somewhere. There are several stones. They're just washed and just hard to read. I can't read them. And it could be any one of those, or there's a lot of area around here where seemingly nobody is buried. She might be just under the ground. You know, stone is gone. Maybe there was never a stone, but I think there was. Anyway, that would be the oldest one, 1802. Now keep in mind, there was a small church here, I guess a Chapel of Ease, but this church was not built in 1850, 52, something like that. So anyway, the oldest one, can't find it. I'm not even sure it exists, but she's here. This is the marker of Captain James G. Spann. He was a captain in the Confederate Army. Remember I told you I like to look up people if I find these stones and see if they've done anything interesting or different or whatever. So I looked him up. He comes from a very, very wealthy family. Owned land in Alabama and here in South Carolina that he had, the land in Alabama he had inherited. The neat thing about Mr. Spann, Mr. James G. Spann, is that as he was going off to war, he had a will made basically saying that I could die in this war and this is how I want things done. As part of the will, he said when things are being divided, keep the slave families together. Do not break them up. I thought that was pretty noble of him. I've come to find out that a lot of slave owners were basically reluctant slave owners. I'm not trying to defend the institution or anything, but they were basically stuck in a system that if they broke that system, they would be broke themselves. Now, you could talk about moral integrity and all that stuff if you want to, but that was just a fact. I mean, how many of us are stuck in jobs that we don't like, but we do because we got to go pay the bills? Of course, I guess the difference in that is there's probably no moral issues to leave your job. Anyway, I believe he was a reluctant slave owner, stuck in the times, and he didn't want the families broke up. By the way, he was killed in the war. I'm not sure how happy he would be to have the American flag there. I don't know. When the war was over, many of them wanted to get on with their life and basically forgive and forget, so he might be okay with it. I don't know. That's a wrap, my friends.